Hey there, and welcome back to Drowsy History. Or if you're new here, welcome. I'm very glad you found your way to this particular corner of the internet at this particular hour. Before we begin tonight, I want to ask you for two small things. First, if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. It costs you nothing, and it genuinely helps this channel reach more people who are lying in the dark, looking for a slow, calm voice to carry them towards sleep. Second, leave me a comment. Nothing long, nothing elaborate. Just tell me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. I read every single one, and I find something quietly wonderful about knowing that people in so many different places and time zones are sharing the same slow words on the same night. Now, put your phone down if you can, or set it somewhere comfortable. Let your shoulders drop, let your jaw unclench. It's almost always at least a little clenched. Take one slow breath and let it go. Good. Tonight we're going on a journey, not a fast one. We're going to move slowly as the merchants and pilgrims and soldiers and monks who actually made this journey moved step by step, day by day, through landscapes so vast and so varied that a single lifetime was barely enough to cross them. We're going to follow the Silk Road, but we're not going to follow the version of it that gets told in the tourist brochures, the version full of glittering bazaars and exotic spices and the gentle tinkle of camel bells in the golden desert light. We're going to follow the real one, the Silk Road, or rather the web of overlapping routes that historians came to call by that name, was one of the most important arteries in human history. For roughly 1,000 years, from around the 2nd century BCE to the 15th century CE, it connected China to the Mediterranean world across thousands of kilometers of mountains, deserts, steppes, and river valleys. It carried silk, of course, but also paper, glass, cotton, spices, porcelain, horses, gold, disease, religion, art, technology, and ideas in both directions. It was the internet of the pre-modern world, a system for the transmission of everything humanity had made and thought and believed, moving at the speed of a loaded camel. But the Silk Road was not safe. It was not comfortable. It was not a place where merchants strolled cheerfully between welcoming caravanserais, conducting pleasant transactions with colorful strangers. It was a place where people died of thirst in deserts so vast that a wrong turn meant a skeleton bleaching in the sun. It was a place where bandits waited in the mountain passes, where protection money was a cost of doing business, where plague moved with the caravans as surely as silk did, and where the empires and kingdoms that lined the route rose and fell with a regularity that made the concept of a safe road essentially fictional for long stretches of time. The dark side of the Silk Road is not separate from its glory. It is woven into it. The same routes that carried Buddhism to China also carried the plague of Justinian to Constantinople. The same Mongol Empire that briefly made the road safer than it had ever been also killed in the conquest that made that safety possible, somewhere between 30 and 40 million people. The silk that made Roman senators swoon was produced under conditions of labor that would make a modern labor inspector faint. The caravanserais that offered shelter in the desert were also places where thieves, slavers, and informers mixed freely with the pilgrims and the merchants. So let's begin. Get comfortable. There's no hurry. These roads have been waiting for 2,000 years, and they can wait a little longer while you settle in. Before we can talk about the darkness, we need to understand what we're talking about because the term Silk Road is in some important ways a misleading one. The phrase itself was coined by a German geographer named Ferdinand von Richthofen in 1877, which means it is a 19th century European invention applied retroactively to a set of trade routes that the people who actually used them never called by any single name. The merchants and pilgrims and officials who traveled these routes thought of themselves as traveling between specific cities, through specific kingdoms, along specific mountain passes. They did not have a concept of a single unified road in the way that the term implies. What they had was a web, a constantly shifting, constantly renegotiated network of paths and passes and river crossings and stopping points, some of which were reliable for centuries and some of which appeared for a generation and then vanished when a kingdom fell or a well dried up or a mountain pass was blocked by a new political border. The routes ran very roughly from the ancient Chinese capital of Chang'an, modern Xi'an, westward through the Hexi Corridor, the narrow strip of land between the Tibetan Plateau to the south and the Gobi Desert to the north, to the edge of the Chinese Empire at Dunhuang. From Dunhuang they split. One route went north of the Taklamakan Desert through oasis cities like Turfan and Kashgar. Another went south of it through Khotan and Yarkand. The Taklamakan is one of the largest sandy deserts in the world, and its name in Uyghur is usually translated as "you go in, you don't come out," a piece of folk etymology that may not be linguistically accurate but is experientially resonant. The routes converged again at Kashgar in what is now China's Xinjiang region, and from there continued westward through the mountain passes of the Pamir Range, the roof of the world, a plateau averaging 4,000 meters in elevation, into Central Asia. In Central Asia, the routes spread out again into another web, passing through the great cities of Samarkand, Bukhara, and Merv, cities whose names have a kind of legendary resonance even now, cities that were for centuries among the wealthiest and most cosmopolitan places on earth, and from there westward through Persia, through Mesopotamia, to the ports of the Levant and the markets of the Byzantine, and then the Arab world, and eventually to Rome and Constantinople at the western end of the chain. There was also a maritime Silk Road running from the ports of southern China through the Strait of Malacca, across the Indian Ocean to the ports of India and the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, connecting to the overland routes in Arabia and Egypt. This maritime route became increasingly important as the overland routes became more disrupted by political instability in the medieval period, and by the 15th century it was the dominant pathway for goods flowing between Asia and Europe. But the overland routes were older, and their story is darker. The total distance from Chang'an to Rome by the overland route was somewhere between 12,000 and 15,000 kilometers, depending on exactly which path you took. A well-organized caravan moving at a reasonable pace could cover perhaps 30 kilometers a day on flat terrain, less in the mountains or desert. This means that the full journey, in theory, took something between 1 and 2 years. In practice, almost no individual merchant made the full journey. The Silk Road worked not as a single transit route, but as a relay system. Merchants from China took goods to Central Asian trading cities, where they sold them to Central Asian merchants who carried them to Persian or Byzantine traders, who moved them onward toward the Mediterranean. The silk that arrived in Rome had been handled by 4, 5, or 6 sets of intermediaries, each of whom had added their own markup. By the time it reached a Roman draper's stall, its price reflected the accumulated risks and profits of everyone who had touched it along the way, which is one reason why Roman silk was so extraordinarily expensive that it was sometimes literally worth its weight in gold. This relay system had important consequences for the nature of the road. It meant that the merchants who used it were not generally making epic solo journeys across the known world. They were running a specific leg of a much longer chain between cities they knew, through terrain they had some familiarity with, in conditions they had some ability to manage. But manage is a relative term when the terrain includes the Taklamakan Desert and the Pamir Plateau, and familiarity does not make a sandstorm less lethal or a mountain pass less treacherous in November. It is also worth understanding what the caravans looked like in practice, because the popular image, a romantic line of camels against a sunset, swaying gently toward a distant horizon, misses a good deal of the reality. A working Silk Road caravan was less a scenic tableau and more a moving city, a dense, slow, smelly, argumentative collection of people, animals, goods, and problems that had to be managed continuously over weeks and months of difficult terrain. The animals were predominantly Bactrian camels, the two-humped variety, native to Central Asia, and one of the most physically extraordinary creatures ever pressed into human service. Bactrian camels can carry loads of 250 kilograms or more over terrain that would destroy a horse or a donkey. They can go several days without water in moderate conditions. They can eat almost anything, including thorny desert scrub that other animals refuse. They can walk through sandstorms that would blind and choke most other animals, their nostrils capable of clamping almost entirely shut against blowing sand, their eyes protected by 2 sets of lashes that interlock like curtains. But Bactrian camels are not easy to work with. They bite, they spit with accuracy and purpose. They groan at a volume that seems disproportionate to the cause when they are being loaded. They are clever in ways that make them difficult to control when they decide they don't want to cooperate. And a loaded caravan camel that goes lame or sick or simply decides to stop moving in the middle of a desert is a crisis, because the goods it was carrying have to be redistributed among the other animals. The sick animal has to be managed or abandoned, and the resulting delay in terrain where water and food are finite can have consequences that multiply quickly. The caravan master, the caravan bashi in the Turkic languages that were dominant across much of the route, the sarhang in Persian, was the person responsible for managing all of this: the animals, the goods, the personnel, the route decisions, the negotiations with officials and bandits, and toll collectors at the borders of kingdoms and the gates of cities. It was a job that combined the skills of a logistics manager, a diplomat, a veterinarian, a navigator, and a security contractor, and the people who did it well were rewarded accordingly. The caravan master's knowledge of the road, the location of water sources, the seasonal conditions of the mountain passes, the political situation in the territories ahead, the reputations of the officials at the various checkpoints, was knowledge accumulated over years of experience, the kind that could not be learned from a text, but had to be lived into, one difficult journey at a time. Let us start with the most straightforward of the Silk Road's dangers, the landscape itself. The Taklamakan Desert covers roughly 337,000 square kilometers in the heart of what is now Xinjiang, China. It is a cold desert, not the warm sands of popular imagination, but a place of extreme temperature swings, where summer highs can reach 40 degrees Celsius and winter nights can drop to -20. It is almost entirely waterless. The rivers that flow into it from the surrounding mountains disappear into the sand and are absorbed before they reach the center. There are no oases in the interior. The only way to cross it is around the edges, along the routes that connect the string of oasis cities on its northern and southern rims. And even those edges were dangerous enough that travelers died on them regularly. The primary source of death was not, as the imagination tends to picture it, dramatic. Not a sudden sandstorm burying an entire caravan in a matter of minutes, though sandstorms of genuine violence did occur. The primary source of death was simpler and slower. It was thirst. A caravan that miscalculated the distance between water sources, or that arrived at a known well and found it dry or fouled, or that was slowed by a sick animal, or a broken axle, or a dispute among its members, could find itself running out of water in terrain where the next source was 2 days' travel away. 2 days without water in desert heat is, for most people, fatal. The sandstorms themselves deserve their own attention because the experience of being caught in one, as described in the accounts of travelers who survived, was something that the word sandstorm does not adequately prepare you for. The Taklamakan sandstorms, called Karaburan, the Black Hurricane by local people, could rise with relatively little warning, the horizon darkening and the temperature dropping as the wind picked up from the northwest. Within minutes, the sky turned from blue to brown to almost black. The light reduced to a sickly yellowish dimness, and the air itself became a flowing medium of fine sand particles that penetrated every gap in clothing, every crevice in baggage, every nostril and ear and eye. The sound was a constant low roar. Visibility dropped to a few meters, then less. The camels, their senses more attuned to the desert than any humans, would turn their backs to the wind and simply stop, sitting down with their legs folded, their heads lowered, waiting it out. The humans had to do the same, hunker down in the shelter of the camels' bodies, press cloth against their faces, breathe shallowly, and wait. A serious Karaburan could last for hours. During it, movement was impossible, and when it passed, the landscape had been rearranged. Familiar landmarks were buried, the surface of the desert had a new shape, and the path the caravan had been following might be indistinguishable from the surrounding sand. It is not a coincidence that the Taklamakan contains dozens of buried cities, settlements that were swallowed by the shifting sands when the water sources that fed them dried up, or when the political conditions that sustained them changed and that were never rebuilt. Archaeologists working in the desert in the 20th century discovered cities that had been inhabited as recently as the 3rd and 4th centuries CEE and were now 3 or 4 meters below the surface of the sand. Complete city plans preserved under the desert, with streets and houses and storerooms and Buddhist temples, their contents intact because the dry air of the Taklamakan is one of the best preservatives in the world. Wooden beams from those houses are still solid. Fragments of silk fabric found in them retain color. Documents written on wood and leather are still legible. The desert that killed these cities also kept them. The archaeology of the Silk Road's desert sections has uncovered evidence of this death in abundance. The sites around Dunhuang, the great oasis city at the eastern edge of the Taklamakan, have yielded caches of documents, the famous Dunhuang manuscripts, discovered in a sealed cave in 1900, dating from the 4th to the 11th centuries CE, that include letters and contracts and administrative documents, but also personal communications, letters from stranded travelers, petitions for help, descriptions of caravans that went wrong. A letter from a Sogdian merchant named Nanai Dat, written around 313 CE and never delivered. It was found still sealed in the ruins of a watchtower near Dunhuang, describes a series of disasters: the collapse of trade, the abandonment of a trading post, merchants stranded without goods or funds. And I myself have been in Dunhuang for 3 years, he writes, and the patience in that sentence, the weariness of it, carries across 17 centuries without any difficulty at all. The oasis cities that made the desert routes possible were themselves strange and fragile places. Khotan, on the southern rim of the Taklamakan, was fed by rivers flowing from the Kunlun Mountains to the south, and it was those rivers that made it livable, a small zone of green and cultivated land in the middle of one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth. The city was prosperous. It was a significant production center for jade, which flowed eastward to China, and for silk, whose production techniques had been smuggled out of China sometime in the first centuries CE, despite the Chinese Empire's attempts to maintain a monopoly on sericulture. But Khotan's prosperity was always precarious. The rivers that fed it were unpredictable. The desert that surrounded it was always present, and the political situation, caught between the competing pressures of the Chinese Empire to the east, the Kushan Empire to the west, and the nomadic peoples of the steppes to the north, meant that the city's independence and safety were perpetually at risk. Merv, in what is now Turkmenistan, was one of the great cities of the Central Asian Silk Road, a hub where routes from China, India, Persia, and the Mediterranean world intersected. At various points in its history, it was one of the largest cities on Earth, with a population that may have reached several 100,000 at its peak in the 12th century CE. It sat in the middle of the Karakum Desert, the Black Sand Desert, kept alive by a sophisticated irrigation system that channeled water from the Murgab River into a network of canals that sustained the city and its agricultural hinterland. Merv's wealth was enormous. Its libraries and scholars made it an intellectual center. Its markets received goods from every corner of the known world. In 1221, the Mongols came to Merv. We will return to the Mongols, but let us say for now that after the Mongols were done with Merv, it never fully recovered, and the irrigation system that had kept it alive for centuries was damaged beyond easy repair. The desert, which had always been waiting at the edges, moved in. The ruins of ancient Merv, the successive layers of cities built on top of one another over more than 4,000 years, sit in the desert now, largely unexcavated, the wind moving through them. They are extraordinary and very quiet. The Pamir Plateau presented a different kind of landscape challenge. If the desert's danger was dryness, heat, and disorientation, the Pamir's danger was altitude, cold, and the fundamental structural hostility of high mountains to human movement. The passes through which the Silk Road crossed the Pamirs were high, some of them above 4,000 meters, and they were only passable during a narrow window of the year, typically late summer and early autumn, when the snow had melted enough to make the paths navigable and the winter snows had not yet begun. A caravan that was delayed and missed this window could be trapped on the wrong side of the mountains for months, waiting for spring. Even in the favorable season, the passes were brutal. The altitude caused altitude sickness, a cluster of symptoms ranging from headache and nausea at the mild end to pulmonary edema and cerebral edema, both potentially fatal at the severe end in anyone who climbed too quickly. The animals suffered as well. Horses and camels, already loaded with goods, labored up paths that were sometimes barely wide enough for a single animal on surfaces of rock and scree that were treacherous underfoot. The cold came quickly in the mountains, even in summer, and a storm that swept in during a crossing could drop visibility to nothing and lower the temperature to dangerous levels within hours. The Chinese Buddhist pilgrim Xuanzang, who crossed the Pamirs in the 7th century CEs on his famous journey to India and back, describes the experience in his travel memoir with a combination of genuine awe and barely concealed terror. The mountains, he writes, are so cold that they are never free of snow and ice. The roads are precipitous and the passes narrow. There are hanging roads, presumably sections where the path was so narrow that it was held up by wooden beams driven into the cliff face, with nothing but air below, that a caravan had to cross single file, with care, one step at a time. He describes losing people and animals to the conditions, the cold, the falls. He was one of the most determined and experienced travelers of his age, and the Pamirs still nearly killed him. The natural dangers of the Silk Road's terrain were real and well documented, but the human dangers were, in many ways, more pervasive and more calculated. The routes that connected the great cities of the ancient world ran through vast expanses of thinly populated, poorly governed territory, and such territory has, throughout human history, tended to attract a particular kind of resident, people who found it more profitable to take things from travelers than to produce things themselves. Banditry on the Silk Road was not a marginal or episodic phenomenon. It was a structural feature of the route that merchants had to plan for, budget for, and protect against as a route and cost of doing business. The caravans themselves were a response to this. A single merchant traveling alone with his goods was a target. A caravan of 40 or 50 merchants traveling together with armed guards and a collective capacity for self-defense was a much harder target. There is safety in numbers, and the caravan system that developed along the Silk Road was in large part a security system as much as a logistical one. The size of caravans varied enormously. A small caravan might be a dozen people and 20 or 30 pack animals. A large one might involve hundreds of people, thousands of animals, and a small military escort. The Chinese Buddhist pilgrim Faxian, who traveled the Silk Road in the late 4th and early 5th centuries CE, typically traveled with groups of other pilgrims and traders for exactly this reason. He describes crossing the Taklamakan with a large caravan, noting the presence of guides who knew the route and the location of water sources. He also describes losing traveling companions to illness and the conditions, which suggests that even the protection of numbers was not enough to guarantee survival. The professional bandits who preyed on caravans were not random opportunists. They were often organized, knowledgeable about caravan routes and schedules, and sophisticated in their methods. They knew which mountain passes were unavoidable, where caravans had to slow down to navigate difficult terrain, and where the nearest help was too far away to matter. They sometimes worked in cooperation with corrupt officials who provided information about the timing and composition of valuable caravans. They sometimes worked in cooperation with the owners of caravanserais, the roadside inns that provided shelter and supplies to caravans, who could identify particularly rich targets and pass the information along. The relationship between legitimate authority and banditry on the Silk Road was not a simple one of opposition. The governments and rulers whose territories the roads ran through had strong incentives to keep the routes safe because the taxes and tolls they could collect from passing trade were a significant source of revenue, but they also had limited capacity to actually patrol the vast distances involved. The solution, over much of the route's history, was not direct policing, but a system of protection money that existed in the space between taxation and extortion. A caravan entering a particular ruler's territory paid for safe passage, a fee, sometimes called a toll, and sometimes acknowledged more frankly as protection money that purchased a guarantee of security from the ruler's own forces and implicitly from the bandits who operated under the ruler's sufferance or his effective control. When this system worked, it was expensive but functional. When it broke down, when the ruler was weak, or when authority over a particular territory was contested between competing powers, the result was open banditry with no accountability. The Sogdian merchants, a group we will discuss in more detail shortly, were the most important merchant class on the Silk Road for much of its history, and their letters and contracts give us some of the most direct evidence for the practical management of the road's dangers. The Sogdians were from the region around Samarkand in what is now Uzbekistan, and they established trading colonies throughout Central Asia and into China, operating a network of long-distance trade that lasted for centuries. Their business letters reveal a world of constant negotiation with political instability. Letters that begin with news of a military coup, a city that has been sacked, a route that is now too dangerous, and that pivot without particular drama to the practical question of what alternative route to take and how to protect the goods in transit. The pragmatism is striking. Catastrophe is noted, adapted to, and business continues. The caravanserai system, which provided shelter and supplies to caravans at regular intervals along the route, was one of the most important institutional responses to the road's dangers, and it too had its own shadow side. The caravanserai, called a han in Turkish, a ribbit in Arabic, a sarai in Persian, was a substantial building, usually built around a large courtyard where the animals could be kept at night, with rooms for travelers arranged around the perimeter, a well or cistern for water, and storage facilities for goods. They were built and maintained by rulers and wealthy patrons as acts of both piety and commercial sense. A well-maintained caravanserai on a busy route attracted traffic, and traffic generated tax revenue. The best caravanserais were genuinely impressive buildings, with elaborately decorated gates and comfortable facilities that compared favorably with contemporary urban inns. But the caravanserai was also a place of significant vulnerability. All your goods were in one place. Other travelers, many of them strangers, knew what you were carrying and where you were going. The staff of the caravanserai had interests that were not necessarily aligned with yours, and the walls that kept the robbers out were exactly the same walls that kept you in if the robbers were already inside when you arrived. Medieval Arabic and Persian literature contains a genre of cautionary tales set in caravanserais, stories of merchants who were drugged by their host and robbed while they slept, of travelers who were murdered for their goods by their companions on the road, of caravanserai keepers who worked in partnership with bandits to select and mark the most valuable targets. Some of these tales are fictional moralizing, others read as straightforward accounts of things that actually happened with some regularity. The legal mechanisms for dealing with robbery and violence on the road were real but limited. The Chinese Empire maintained a system of watchtowers and garrison posts along the Hexi corridor and the edges of the Taklamakan, both for military purposes and to provide security for the trade routes. The inscriptions and documents found at Dunhuang include official records of caravan registrations. Merchants entering or leaving Chinese territory were required to register their goods and travel documents at official checkpoints that suggest a degree of administrative oversight of the road that would have had some deterrent effect on banditry in the immediate vicinity of Chinese authority. But the immediate vicinity of Chinese authority ended at Dunhuang, and beyond it, the road ran through territories where the reach of any stable government was limited and the risk of violence was substantially higher. There was also a category of danger that sat in the space between banditry and war. The nomadic peoples of the Central Asian steppes, whose relationship with the Silk Road cities was one of the most complex and consequential dynamics in the history of the route. The Silk Road ran for much of its length through or along the edges of a vast zone of grassland, the Eurasian steppe, that stretched from the Hungarian plain in the west to Manchuria in the east, and that was home to a series of nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples whose economy was based on pastoralism, the herding of horses, cattle, sheep, and goats across seasonal migration routes. These peoples, the Scythians, the Xiongnu, the Huns, the Turks, the Khitans, the Mongols, and many others, were some of the most skilled horsemen and warriors in the world, and their relationship with the agricultural civilizations and trading cities that bordered their territories was one of the central tensions of Eurasian history for 2,000 years. From the perspective of the Silk Road, the nomads were simultaneously a threat and an opportunity. The threat was obvious. A confederation of nomadic warriors descending on an oasis city or a caravan was a force that few settled peoples could resist. The Silk Road cities were prosperous. Their walls were sometimes formidable, but their military capacity was generally no match for a fully mobilized nomadic army. The history of the Silk Road is littered with the ruins of cities that were destroyed or severely damaged by nomadic raids or invasions. Merv, Nishapur, Urgench, Samarkand, all of these great cities were sacked at various points in their histories, some more than once. But the opportunity was equally significant. The nomads needed things that the settled civilizations produced: grain, textiles, metal tools, and weapons, luxury goods. The settled civilizations needed things that the nomads provided: horses above all, which were essential for both military and agricultural purposes in much of Eurasia, but also wool, leather, and the security that came from having a nomadic confederation as an ally rather than an enemy. This mutual need created a trading relationship that was often interrupted by violence, but never entirely severed. The horses that the Chinese empires needed from the nomadic peoples of the steppe were not a minor commodity. They were a strategic resource of the first importance. The famous blood sweating horses of Fergana, the tall, powerful horses bred in the valleys of modern Uzbekistan, which were qualitatively superior to the small, sturdy steppe ponies that Central Asian nomads used, were so prized by the Han Emperor Wu that he launched two full-scale military expeditions into Central Asia at enormous cost in men and money, specifically to obtain breeding stock. The second of these expeditions, in 101 BCE, resulted in the capture of several dozen Fergana horses and was recorded as a significant imperial achievement. The campaigns that secured those horses cost the lives of perhaps 100,000 soldiers and resulted in the deaths of the vast majority of the horses themselves during the long march back to China. The trade that subsequently developed, silk going west, horses coming east, was one of the earliest and most important structured exchange relationships of the Silk Road, and it shaped the politics of the Chinese borderlands for centuries. The Chinese empires along the eastern end of the Silk Road managed their relationship with the nomadic Xiongnu, the confederation that dominated the steppe to their north from roughly the 3rd century BCE to the 2nd century CE, through a combination of military confrontation, wall building, and what the Chinese sources call tributary relations, but what modern historians sometimes describe as tribute paid in the other direction. The Han dynasty regularly sent the Xiongnu enormous quantities of silk, grain, and other goods, along with Chinese princesses as brides, in exchange for peace along the northern frontier. The Silk Road itself, in one of its earliest forms, grew partly out of this relationship. The silk that the Han sent to the Xiongnu was retraded by the Xiongnu to Central Asian merchants who carried it westward. The famous journey of the Chinese envoy Zhang Qian to the west in around 130 BCE, often cited as the beginning of the Silk Road, was partly a diplomatic mission to find allies who could help the Han outflank the Xiongnu from the west. The Xiongnu were eventually fragmented by a combination of Chinese military pressure and internal divisions, some of their constituent groups migrating westward across the steppe in a movement that would eventually, in the late 4th and 5th centuries CE, contribute to the destabilization of the Roman Empire under the name of the Huns. But as one nomadic confederation declined, another rose to take its place. The succession of steppe powers that dominated the Central Asian section of the Silk Road, the Kushans, the Hephthalites, the Turks, the Uyghurs, and eventually the Mongols, ensured that the relationship between nomad and settled world was never simple, never stable, and never without the latent threat of violence. The experience of a merchant caravan in a region under effective nomadic control varied enormously depending on the political situation and the intentions of the nomadic rulers at any given moment. Some nomadic rulers were sophisticated managers of Silk Road trade, understanding perfectly well that a prosperous trade route through their territory produced more revenue than a destroyed one. The Uyghur Empire, which dominated much of Central Asia in the 8th and 9th centuries CE, was a major player in Silk Road trade, providing security along routes through their territory in exchange for trade access and political recognition. The first Turk Khagans, who controlled the great central section of the overland route in the 6th century CE, negotiated directly with the Byzantine and Sasanian empires over trade rights and access. But when nomadic power was contested, or when a particular ruler decided that raiding was more profitable than taxing, the experience of the merchant on the road became one of genuine existential risk. The Hephthalites, the White Huns, who dominated Central Asia in the 5th and 6th centuries CEE, had a reputation for unpredictability that made them one of the most feared groups on the route, capable of being reliable trade partners one year and devastating raiders the next, depending on their internal political dynamics and the strength of their neighbors. No discussion of the Silk Road can proceed far without talking about the Sogdians, and no discussion of them can avoid the paradox at the heart of their story. They were the most important commercial class on the most important trade route in the ancient world, and almost no one outside of specialist scholarship had heard of them until the 20th century. The Sogdians came from Sogdia, a region centered on the fertile valleys of the Zarafshan and Kashkadarya rivers in what is now Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. Their principal cities, Samarkand, Bukhara, Panjikent, were prosperous, sophisticated, and cosmopolitan, sitting at the intersection of Iranian, Greek, Indian, and Chinese cultural influences. The Sogdians were the great middlemen of the Silk Road, establishing colonies of merchants in cities along the entire length of the route from the Byzantine frontier to the Tang dynasty capital of Chang'an, and operating a trading network of extraordinary reach and durability. What made the Sogdians exceptional was not just their commercial range, but their cultural adaptability. Moving through a world of enormous religious and cultural diversity, the route passed through Buddhist, Zoroastrian, Manichaean, Nestorian Christian, and later Islamic territories. The Sogdians adopted a pragmatic approach to religion that allowed them to function effectively in all of these environments. A Sogdian merchant colony in China might maintain a Zoroastrian fire temple for its own religious observances while participating freely in Chinese Buddhist festivals and dealing comfortably with Confucian officials. This flexibility was not necessarily cynicism. Many individual Sogdians were evidently devout practitioners of their religions, but it was a practical acknowledgement that long-distance trade in a multi-religious world required a capacity for cultural code switching. The Sogdian letters, discovered near Dunhuang, the ones we briefly met in the previous chapter, are among the most vivid direct evidence for the experience of Silk Road merchants. They were written around 313 CEE, apparently by a group of Sogdian merchants stranded in various cities along the eastern section of the route, and addressed to merchants back in Samarkand. Their content is a mixture of commercial news, personal complaint, and desperate requests for assistance, and they read with an immediacy that is almost shocking. These are real people in real trouble, writing to people they know and trust in a recognizably human voice. One of the letters describes the sack of Luoyang, then the capital of China, by the Xiongnu in 311 CE. And the last emperor, so they say, fled from Ye because of the famine. His palace and walled city were set on fire. This is the first known mention of this historical event in a non Chinese source, written by a Sogdian merchant who had been personally affected by the resulting disruption to trade. The tone is that of a businessman reporting bad news, factual, concerned about the commercial implications, focused on what comes next. The fall of a Chinese imperial capital is significant primarily because it affects the trade routes. But the Sogdians' commercial world had its own darkness. The Sogdian trading network was not a business of clean hands. The goods that flowed through it included, alongside silk and spices and glass and horses, enslaved people. The slave trade was one of the significant commerce streams of the Silk Road world, and the Sogdians were participants in it, as were virtually all the major commercial players on the route. Enslaved people moved along the same roads as silk and pepper, bought and sold at the same markets, transported in the same caravans. The sources document enslaved people of Central Asian, Indian, East African, Turkish, and Chinese origin moving through the Silk Road trading system in all directions. The trade in enslaved people on the Silk Road was not identical to the Atlantic slave trade of the early modern period. It was not organized along racial lines in the same systematic way. It involved a different set of legal and social frameworks, and the conditions of enslaved people varied enormously depending on their owners and their functions. But it was large, it was profitable, and the suffering it produced was real. The raiding of settled communities by nomadic groups, one of the perpetual dangers of life along the route, produced enslaved captives as one of its primary outputs. Cities sacked by armies had their surviving populations marched away to be sold. Poor families, in times of famine, sold their children. Pirates operating off the coasts captured travelers for resale. All of these streams fed the slave markets that operated in the great trading cities of the route: Samarkand, Merv, Nishapur, and Baghdad. Skilled enslaved workers, craftsmen, musicians, dancers, scribes, physicians, translators commanded premium prices in these markets. The demand for skilled enslaved people drove a particular kind of trade that we might recognize today as a market in human talent operating under conditions of coercion. A Byzantine emperor's court might contain enslaved musicians from Persia. A Chinese imperial palace might contain enslaved dancers from Central Asia. The Sogdian whirl, a spinning dance form associated with Central Asian performers, appears in Tang Dynasty Chinese poetry as a fashionable entertainment. An Abbasid caliph's household might include enslaved translators who could work between Arabic, Persian, Greek, and any number of Central Asian languages. The cosmopolitanism of the Silk Road world, that quality of cultural mixing and exchange that made it so intellectually and artistically productive, was in part built on the forced movement of skilled people across the route's enormous distances. The Sogdian legal documents from Silk Road sites include contracts for the sale and purchase of enslaved people, written in the same business-like language as contracts for the sale of silk or horses. The names of the enslaved people survive in these documents, listed as items. Their experiences do not survive, because there was no mechanism within the commercial and legal system of the Silk Road world to record them. There is a particular kind of darkness on the Silk Road that requires us to think not about violence or theft or political instability, but about biology. The Silk Road was not just a conduit for goods and ideas, it was a conduit for disease, a pathway along which pathogens could travel with extraordinary efficiency, carried by people and animals moving between ecological zones that had previously been isolated from one another. The concept is now familiar to anyone who lived through the early years of the COVID-19 pandemic. A disease that emerges in one part of the world can move through a connected global system with devastating speed. In the ancient and medieval world, the Silk Road was the primary global connective system, and it played this role in disease transmission with terrible effectiveness. The plague of Justinian, which struck the Byzantine Empire in 541 CEE and recurred intermittently for the next 2 centuries, killing somewhere between 25 and 50 million people, a significant fraction of the population of the known world, is now believed by most historians and epidemiologists to have been bubonic plague, the same disease caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis that would return 6 centuries later as the Black Death. The plague of Justinian almost certainly traveled along the Silk Road and its maritime extensions. The most likely origin of the outbreak is Central Asia, and it appears first in historical sources in Egypt, consistent with the maritime Silk Road route from Central Asia through the Persian Gulf and Red Sea to Alexandria. From Egypt, it spread to Constantinople, and from Constantinople throughout the Byzantine world. The mechanism of transmission was a classic Silk Road story. Goods, animals, and people moving along connected routes, carrying with them the fleas and rats that harbored the plague bacterium, depositing them in new cities where the local population had no immunity and the local rodents had no previous exposure to the pathogen. A merchant caravan moving from Central Asia to the Mediterranean was, from the perspective of Yersinia pestis, a perfect delivery system, a warm, mobile, food-rich environment carrying a large population of rodents and fleas across thousands of kilometers of varied terrain, stopping at intervals in cities where the pathogen could be deposited and spread. It is worth dwelling for a moment on the scale of what the plague of Justinian did to the world through which it moved, because it tends to be overshadowed in popular consciousness by the Black Death 8 centuries later, and its significance is consequently underappreciated. The Byzantine historian Procopius, who was an eyewitness to the plague's arrival in Constantinople in 541 CE and wrote about it in detail, describes the city at the height of the outbreak in terms that read like nothing so much as accounts of the COVID-19 pandemic. People afraid to leave their houses, the sick dying alone because family members were afraid to approach them, the normal social rituals of death, the funeral rites, the mourning, the public acknowledgement, breaking down because there were too many dead to process through the usual channels. Procopius describes bodies piled in the streets and in open fields outside the city because the cemeteries were full. He describes the Byzantine Emperor Justinian himself falling ill, though the emperor recovered. The economic disruption was severe. Tax revenues collapsed. The army could not be paid or supplied. The great military campaigns that Justinian had launched to reconquer the Western Roman Empire were disrupted and eventually abandoned. The plague of Justinian may have done more to determine the shape of the early medieval world than any battle or political decision, and it traveled to Constantinople on the same routes that carried silk and spices. The Black Death of the 14th century followed a similar pattern, and the evidence for its Silk Road origin is somewhat better than for the Justinian plague. Genetic analysis of Yersinia pestis strains, combined with the dating of the earliest confirmed outbreak sites, points to Central Asia as the likely origin point for the 14th century pandemic. Cemeteries near the city of Issyk-Kul in what is now Kyrgyzstan have been excavated and found to contain a cluster of graves from 1338 and 1339, with inscriptions noting that the deaths were from a pestilence, an unusual inscription since plague deaths were typically not specifically noted in burial inscriptions unless the disease was so severe and so distinctive that it demanded acknowledgement. The molecular analysis of DNA from some of these burials has confirmed the presence of Yersinia pestis. The dates are exactly right for a disease that began to spread westward along the Silk Road in the late 1330s and reached the Black Sea ports of Kaffa and Trebizond by around 1346, from where it entered the Mediterranean maritime system and began its catastrophic journey through Europe. The story of Kaffa is one of the more extraordinary moments at the intersection of Silk Road history and disease history. Kaffa was a Genoese trading colony on the Crimean Peninsula, a major node in the network that connected the Silk Road to the Mediterranean markets. In 1346, the city was besieged by Mongol forces under Jani Beg, and the Mongol army was suffering severely from plague. According to a contemporary account by an Italian notary named Gabriele de Musis, admittedly a source with some credibility issues, writing some distance from the events, the Mongols catapulted the bodies of their Plask dead over the walls of Kaffa in what would constitute one of the earliest documented instances of biological warfare. The Genoese merchants inside the city, already suffering their own plague casualties, loaded their ships and fled, carrying the disease with them to Constantinople, Messina, Genoa, and Marseille. Whether or not the catapult story is entirely accurate, the mechanism it describes, plague moving from the Mongol-controlled steppe through a Silk Road trading city onto a Mediterranean merchant ship, is exactly how the disease almost certainly did enter Europe. The Silk Road, at the height of its medieval integration under the Pax Mongolica, had created a connected system of sufficient reach and traffic that a pathogen could move from Central Asia to Sicily in under a decade. The Black Death killed roughly a third of Europe's population in the first outbreak alone. In some cities and regions, the mortality was higher. The city of Florence lost perhaps half its population. Egypt, which was hit before Europe, may have lost a third to a half. China, where the plague had been circulating before it reached Europe, suffered enormously, though the mortality statistics are harder to establish. The total death toll across Eurasia and North Africa in the 14th century pandemic is estimated at somewhere between 75 million and 200 million people, a range of uncertainty that reflects the difficulty of demographic history, but whose lower bound alone represents a catastrophe without parallel in human history until the 20th century. The Silk Road did not exist in a political vacuum. Its roots ran through the territories of a succession of empires and kingdoms that competed for control over the trade flowing through them and the fortunes of the road were intimately tied to the political stability or instability of those states. In the centuries around the beginning of the Common Era, the Silk Road's eastern section was controlled by the Han Dynasty of China, its western section by the Roman Empire, and the vast middle section by a sequence of powers: the Parthian Empire in Persia, the Kushan Empire in Central Asia and Afghanistan and northwestern India. This was, relatively speaking, a period of political stability. All four of these empires were large, organized, and capable of maintaining at least some degree of order along the routes they controlled. It was during this period that the Silk Road first reached its full extent, connecting the Han capital to the Roman Mediterranean for the first time. But the stability was always partial and always temporary. The Parthian Empire, which controlled the crucial middle section of the overland route through Persia and Mesopotamia, had a complicated relationship with both Rome and China. The Parthians were sophisticated traders who understood the value of the transit trade that flowed through their territory, but they also had strong incentives to maintain their position as intermediaries and to prevent direct contact between Rome and China that might allow the two empires to deal directly with each other and cut the Parthian middlemen out. Whether or not they actively obstructed such direct contact is debated. The evidence is ambiguous, but the practical effect of the distance and the political geography was that direct Roman-Chinese contact was extremely limited. The Roman world knew China primarily as the land of Ceres, the Silk People, and had only vague information about its actual location and nature. The 3rd and 4th centuries CEE brought political crisis to most of the great empires along the Silk Road simultaneously. The Han Dynasty collapsed into civil war in 220 CEE and was eventually replaced by a succession of competing states that took several centuries to sort themselves out. The Roman Empire entered its own prolonged crisis, the crisis of the 3rd century, from 235 to 284 CE, during which the empire nearly collapsed under the pressure of military coups, barbarian invasions, and economic disruption. The Kushan Empire fragmented under pressure from the Sasanian Empire in the west and various nomadic groups in the north and east. The Silk Road did not cease to function during these crises, but it became more fragmented, more dangerous, and less reliably profitable. The rise of Islam in the 7th century CE produced one of the most significant political reconfigurations in Silk Road history. The Arab conquests of the 7th and 8th centuries brought Persia, Mesopotamia, the Levant, Egypt, and eventually Central Asia as far as the Oxus River under the control of the Umayyad and then Abbasid caliphates. This was a transformation of enormous speed and scope. Within a century of the Prophet Muhammad's death in 632 CE, the Arab Islamic world controlled most of the western and central sections of the Silk Road. For the road itself, the consequences were complex. On one hand, the unification of such a large territory under a single political and religious system reduced the number of political borders a caravan had to cross and the Islamic world's generally positive attitude toward trade. The Prophet himself had been a merchant, and the Quran treats honest commerce favorably, created a supportive institutional environment for Silk Road merchants. Samarkand and Bukhara, absorbed into the caliphate, continued to flourish as trading cities. Baghdad, Founded in 762 Silsiu-e as the Abbasid capital on the banks of the Tigris, quickly became the greatest city in the world, a hub of scholarship, commerce, and cultural production that attracted goods and people from every corner of the Silk Road network. The translation movement centered in Baghdad, the systematic translation into Arabic of Greek philosophical and scientific texts, Persian administrative and literary works, and Indian mathematical and astronomical treatises, drew on knowledge that had been accumulated and transmitted along the Silk Road for centuries. The wealth that funded the Abbasid court and its scholars came ultimately from the trade that flowed through the Caliphate's territories. The intellectual achievements of the Islamic Golden Age were, in a direct, if not always visible way, a product of the same roots and the same commercial networks that also carried plague and slaves. On the other hand, the wars of conquest were devastating to the territories and populations caught up in them. The Arab conquest of Persia and Central Asia was not a peaceful affair. Cities that resisted were sacked, populations were enslaved, agricultural infrastructure was damaged. The Sogdian cities of Transoxiana, the region between the Oxus and Jaxartes rivers, were conquered after prolonged and bloody resistance in the early 8th century, and the process involved significant destruction of the pre-Islamic cultural heritage of the region. The extraordinary painted halls of Panjikent, a Sogdian city, preserve on their walls the remnants of a Zoroastrian and Buddhist artistic tradition that was largely extinguished by the Islamic conquest. Extinguished not immediately or entirely, but over the generations as the old religions were gradually replaced, and the artistic traditions that expressed them became increasingly difficult to practice. We have arrived at the most dramatic single chapter in the dark history of the Silk Road, the Mongol conquests of the 13th century, and the complex aftermath that followed them. The Mongol Empire, built by Genghis Khan and his successors, was the largest contiguous land empire in human history. At its greatest extent, from the Pacific coast of China to the borders of Poland and Hungary, it encompassed roughly a quarter of the Earth's land surface and perhaps a third of its population. Its creation involved some of the most devastating military campaigns in recorded history, and the death tolls associated with the Mongol conquests, difficult to calculate with any precision, and frequently exaggerated in both the medieval sources and in some modern accounts, but real and enormous regardless, are among the largest in history before the 20th century. The speed of the Mongol conquests is one of the things that makes them difficult to process historically. Genghis Khan united the Mongol tribes around 1206 CLE and died in 1227, 21 years later, having in that time conquered northern China, Central Asia, Afghanistan, and Persia, and launched raids into Russia and into India. His successors, continuing the campaigns he had begun, added southern China, the rest of Persia and Iraq, including the sack of Baghdad in 1258, which ended the Abbasid Caliphate and destroyed the greatest library in the world, Russia, Poland, Hungary, and Korea. The entire Silk Road, from China to the borders of Europe, was under Mongol control within roughly 50 years of Genghis Khan's unification of the tribes. To put this in perspective, a merchant caravan leaving Chang'an in 1220 would have crossed through the territory of perhaps 8 or 10 separate political entities before reaching Constantinople. A merchant making the same journey in 1260 would have been in Mongol controlled territory for most of the route. The political map of Eurasia had been redrawn within a human lifetime. The Silk Road cities were among the primary targets and the primary victims of the Mongol advance westward. When Genghis Khan's armies turned toward Central Asia in 1219, they encountered the Khwarezmian Empire, which controlled most of Persia and Central Asia and was, at that moment, one of the most powerful states in the Islamic world. The campaign against the Khwarezmian Empire became one of the most destructive events in Central Asian history. The city of Samarkand, which had been one of the wealthiest and most important cities on the Silk Road for centuries, was taken in 1220. The population was divided by the Mongols into categories. Artisans and skilled workers were taken captive and sent eastward because they had value as producers. Soldiers who had surrendered were recruited into the Mongol army, and a significant portion of the remaining population was killed. The figures given by contemporaries are almost certainly exaggerated. Medieval sources routinely inflated death tolls for rhetorical effect, but the destruction was real. Merv was sacked in 1221 by the forces of Tolui, Genghis Khan's youngest son, and the account of the sack, as recorded by the historian Ibn al-Athir, writing within decades of the event, is one of the most harrowing passages in medieval historiography. Ibn al-Athir writes, "I shrank from recording this disaster. Even now I find it hard to write of it." He was not given to such reluctance. He had written about many catastrophes, and his description of the siege and its aftermath is detailed and specific enough to be credible in its broad outlines. The city was taken after the surrender of its governor. The population was brought out onto the plain, divided, and systematically killed over several days. The irrigation system that had made Merv possible was destroyed. The libraries, Merv had been an intellectual center of the Islamic world, with multiple libraries containing thousands of texts, were burned or scattered. The city that had, within living memory, been one of the largest in the world, was turned into a ruin. Nishapur, another great Silk Road city of Khorasan in northeastern Persia, fell in 1221 as well, with an account of destruction even more extreme. Nishapur had the misfortune of having killed a son-in-law of Genghis Khan during an earlier siege, and the city's fate was accordingly among the worst administered during the campaigns. Contemporary sources describe the complete destruction of the city and the systematic killing of its population over several days, with the addition, almost certainly exaggerated but indicative of the scale, that the Mongols then plowed the ground and planted barley over it to demonstrate that nothing was left. The city was rebuilt by survivors who returned after the Mongol armies moved on, and it recovered slowly over the following decades, but it was never again what it had been. The great university and hospital complex that had made it one of the intellectual centers of the Islamic world was gone. The scope of the destruction across Central Asia and Persia in the years between 1219 and 1223 was such that contemporaries struggled to describe it in terms that would be believed. The Persian historian Atta Malik Juvaini, who wrote his history of the Mongol conquests about a generation later and who was himself a subject of the Mongol Empire, describes the campaigns with a combination of horror and resigned acceptance. He is writing for a Mongol patron. He is himself a survivor of the world the Mongols made, and his account navigates the difficult terrain of telling the truth about events that his patron's ancestors caused, in language that his patron will not find offensive. The result is one of the strangest documents in medieval historiography, an account that does not conceal the scale of the destruction, but frames it within a providential narrative in which the Mongol conquests were, whatever their immediate human cost, part of a larger pattern of divine will. And yet, and yet the story of the Mongols and the Silk Road does not end with destruction. After the conquest came the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace, a period roughly from the mid 13th to the mid 14th century, in which the unified Mongol Empire provided something unprecedented in the history of the overland trade routes, something approaching genuine security across their entire length. The Mongol rulers, once established, proved to be enthusiastic patrons of Silk Road trade. The logistical and intelligence network that had made the military conquest possible, a system of relay stations called Yam in Mongolian, spaced at regular intervals across the entire empire, stocked with fresh horses and provisions, used to move messengers and officials at remarkable speeds, was the same infrastructure that now facilitated the movement of merchants. A passport system called the Gerej, a tablet of metal or wood carried by authorized travelers that guaranteed them safe passage, provisions, and horses at the relay stations, made legitimate travel through Mongol territory significantly safer and faster than it had ever been. A merchant with a Gerej could move across the entire breadth of the empire, from China to Persia, with a level of official backing that no previous system had provided. The accounts of travelers who made use of this system, most famously Marco Polo, but also the Flemish friar William of Rubruck, the Moroccan scholar Ibn Battuta, and numerous less famous figures whose accounts survive in diplomatic and ecclesiastical archives, describe a world of extraordinary connectivity. Marco Polo, whose account of his travels in China and Central Asia in the 1270s is one of the most famous travel narratives in history, describes the relay station system with genuine admiration. The stations every 40 kilometers, the horses available, the provisions provided, the speed of official communication. Whatever the extent of his personal travels, and the details of his itinerary have been debated by scholars for centuries, the general picture of a Mongol empire that actively managed its roads and facilitated the movement of people and goods across them is confirmed by many independent sources. William of Rubruck, who traveled from the court of the French king Louis IX to the court of the great Khan Munka in 1253 to 1255 on a diplomatic mission, left one of the most detailed and honest accounts of travel in the Mongol world. His account is not the polished narrative of a professional writer, but the field notes of a Franciscan friar who was frequently cold, hungry, and bewildered by what he encountered, and whose observations are accordingly frank and specific in ways that more polished accounts sometimes are not. He describes the Kurultai, the Mongol political assembly, with genuine astonishment at its scale. He describes the religious diversity of the Mongol court, where Nestorian Christians, Buddhist monks, shamanist practitioners, and Muslim scholars all competed for the great Khan's favor in a pluralism that was not idealistic tolerance, but practical political management. He describes being given fermented mare's milk, kumis, by his Mongol hosts and his efforts to consume it without obvious disgust, which the hosts would have found offensive. This is one of the most important things the Pax Mongolica produced. The accounts of travelers who were able for the first time in centuries to cross the entire width of Eurasia and bring back first hand descriptions of what they had seen. The resulting expansion of geographical and cultural knowledge, the maps that were updated, the encyclopedias that were revised, the political intelligence that was gathered, had long term consequences for the development of European cartography and for the project of ocean exploration that would eventually make the overland Silk Road obsolete. This is one of the great ironies of Silk Road history. The most open and connected period of the overland route was made possible by the same force that had, a generation earlier, been the most destructive in its history. The road ran through the ruins of the cities that had been built on it, past the mass graves that the conquest had produced, and yet it ran more freely and more safely than it had in centuries. The Pax Mongolica did not last. The Mongol Empire began to fragment in the second half of the 13th century, dividing into four successor states: the Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia and Iraq, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde on the Western Steppe, that were often at war with one another. The integrated system that had made the road safe dissolved along with the political unity that had created it. And then, in the middle of the 14th century, came the plague. We have been following the road's external dangers: geography, bandits, disease, armies. But there is another kind of darkness in the Silk Road story, one that sits at its very source: the conditions under which silk itself was produced. Silk is made from the cocoons of the silkworm, Bombyx mori, a species of moth that has been cultivated in China for so long. The earliest evidence of silk production dates to around 3500 BCE, that it has become entirely dependent on human management and can no longer survive in the wild. The silkworm spins its cocoon from a single continuous strand of silk filament, up to 900 meters long in a single cocoon, and the process of extracting that filament intact requires the cocoon to be heated in boiling water to kill the pupa inside and soften the sericin protein that binds the filament. From a single cocoon, after treatment, the filament can be unwound and combined with other filaments to produce a thread of sufficient strength and weight to be woven. The resulting fabric is extraordinary, lustrous, strong, lightweight, and with a softness and drape that no other natural fiber fully replicates. The Chinese Empire's management of silk production was elaborate, central, and in many periods functionally compulsory for the populations required to produce it. Silk was, for centuries, one of the primary forms in which taxes were paid in China. Peasant households were required to produce not just grain for the tax, but lengths of silk fabric, and the women of these households bore much of the labor burden of sericulture, alongside their agricultural and domestic work. The division of labor in traditional Chinese sericulture was fairly consistent. Men worked the fields, women managed the silkworms, reeled the thread, and wove the fabric. This is not a minor addition to a domestic workload. Silkworm cultivation during the critical period of the worm's development, the period of feeding and growth before it spins its cocoon, required intensive, round the clock attention. The worms needed to be kept at the right temperature, fed with fresh mulberry leaves at regular intervals day and night, protected from loud noises, which apparently disturb them, and from the smell of fish or strong odors, and their trays needed to be cleaned constantly. The period of intensive silkworm care lasted about a month and consumed a disproportionate share of a household's labor. The weavers who produced the finished silk fabric, working in the great imperial workshops of the Tang and Song dynasties, or in the commercial weaving establishments of Suzhou and Hangzhou and the other great silk cities, worked under conditions that combined technical mastery with physical hardship. Silk weaving, especially the production of the complex patterned fabrics, damasks, brocades, woven pictorial silks that commanded the highest prices in international trade, required specialized knowledge of the loom and its operation, concentration sustained over long hours, and fine manual dexterity. The draw loom used to produce patterned weave in China required two operators, a weaver below and a draw boy above, who manipulated the heddles to create the pattern. The draw boy, often literally a child, sat in a cramped position above the loom for hours at a time, performing the same repetitive motion, sequence after sequence. These are the conditions under which the silk that reached Rome was made. The Roman senators in their silk togas, the Byzantine empress in her silk robes, the Arab caliph in his silk hung audience chamber, the silk that clothed and delighted them, came from the hands of Chinese women and children working in conditions of compulsory labor, in workshops that existed primarily to fill the imperial tax quota. The luxury of the western end was sustained by compulsion at the eastern end, a pattern that, if examined too closely, begins to look uncomfortably familiar to anyone with knowledge of more recent economic history. There is a further irony in the story of silk that deserves a moment. The Chinese Empire went to extraordinary lengths to maintain its monopoly on sericulture, the knowledge of how to raise silkworms and reel silk thread, because that monopoly was the foundation of the trade's enormous profitability. The penalty for smuggling silkworm eggs or mulberry seeds out of China was at various points death. The silk trade was a state secret in the most literal sense. The technical process that made it possible was imperial intellectual property, guarded with the full weight of the law. And yet the secret got out. Multiple accounts survive of the means by which sericulture was transmitted westward. The Byzantine historian Procopius, writing in the 6th century CE, describes how two monks, almost certainly Nestorian Christian missionaries operating along the Silk Road, smuggled silkworm eggs out of China, concealed in hollow walking staves, delivering them to the Byzantine Emperor Justinian around 552 CE, and allowing the Byzantine Empire to establish its own silk production industry. Whether the specific account is accurate in its details is debated. Silkworm cultivation had probably been established in Persia and Central Asia before the Byzantine account suggests, through routes less dramatic than monks with hollow staves. But the general story of silk knowledge traveling westward along the Silk Road, despite Chinese efforts to prevent it, is well established. The city of Khotan, on the southern rim of the Taklamakan, is the setting for another version of this story. A legend recorded in Chinese sources describes a Chinese princess married to the king of Khotan who smuggled silkworm eggs to her new home concealed in her elaborate headdress, knowing that the border guards would not dare to search a royal bride. Whether or not this specific event occurred, Khotan was producing its own silk by the early centuries CE, and the Chinese monopoly on sericulture was effectively broken in Central Asia long before Justinian's monks. The secret, like most secrets, eventually traveled along the same roads that carried the silk. The production of silk outside China did not immediately reduce the price or the exclusivity of the finest Chinese silks, which maintained their prestige in international markets partly through genuine quality and partly through the accumulated cultural associations of centuries. The silk workshops of Tang Dynasty China, organized under the oversight of the Bureau of Weaving and Dyeing, one of the imperial administrative organs, continued to produce textiles of a technical sophistication that was not easily matched elsewhere. The complex patterned silks of the Tang period, some of which have survived in extraordinary condition in the dry air of Central Asian sites, are among the most technically accomplished textiles ever woven, requiring a depth of knowledge and a complexity of tooling that a newly established sericulture industry could not replicate overnight. The Silk Road was one of the great conduits of religious transmission in human history. Buddhism traveled eastward from India to China, Korea, and Japan along the routes of the road. Islam traveled in multiple directions from Arabia, eventually reaching Southeast Asia and the western fringes of China. Nestorian Christianity, a form of Christianity condemned as heretical by the Council of Ephesus in 431 CE and subsequently expelled from the Byzantine world, found a new home in Central Asia and eventually established communities as far east as Tang Dynasty China. Manichaeism, the dualist religion founded by the prophet Mani in the 3rd century CE, spread along the road from its Persian origins to become briefly the state religion of the Uyghur Empire and to maintain small communities in China for centuries after it had been suppressed almost everywhere else. Zoroastrianism, the ancient Persian religion, was carried by Sogdian merchants along the route and left its traces in religious art and practice across Central Asia and into China. The story of religious transmission on the Silk Road is, at its best, a story of extraordinary cultural exchange, of ideas and practices finding new homes in distant soils and taking root in forms their originators would not have recognized. The Buddhism that reached China was not identical to the Buddhism of India. It had been transformed by its passage through Central Asia, absorbing elements of Bactrian and Kushano-Gandharan art and thought, and it was further transformed by its encounter with Chinese culture, philosophy, and religious practice. The resulting synthesis, Chinese Buddhism in its various schools, from Chan to Pure Land, is one of the great intellectual and artistic achievements of human history, and it would not have existed without the Silk Road. The story of this transmission is partly the story of the Buddhist pilgrims who traveled the road in both directions. Chinese monks traveling westward to India to collect scriptures and teachings from the source tradition, Indian and Central Asian monks traveling eastward to bring those teachings to new audiences. These pilgrimages were not comfortable journeys. They were acts of religious devotion that also required extraordinary physical endurance, navigational skill, and the capacity to survive for months or years in alien cultural and linguistic environments. The Pilgrim Faxion, who traveled to India between 399 and 414 CE, was already in his 60s when he set out, and he completed the journey on foot, crossing the Pamir Mountains, traveling through what is now Afghanistan and Pakistan to India, collecting scriptures, studying in Indian monasteries, and then sailing home via Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia. He survived. Many pilgrims did not. Xuanzang, who made the journey a century later in 629 to 645 CE, left a longer and more detailed account that remains one of the great travel documents of the ancient world. His memoir and the biography written by his disciple Huili describe the journey in detail. The departure from Chang'an without official permission, because the Tang court had forbidden travel to the west. The crossing of the Gobi Desert with a guide who died early in the journey, leaving Xuanzang to navigate alone. The near death from thirst when he accidentally spilled his water supply. The crossing of the Pamirs with their hanging roads and their cold, the months spent in the oasis cities of Central Asia and the courts of various rulers who tried to keep him as a prestige guest. The years in India studying at the great monastery of Nalanda, which he describes with a reverence that is evident even in translation. He returned with 657 Buddhist texts packed onto 22 horses and spent the rest of his life translating them into Chinese. His journey, fictionalized and mythologized in the 16th century novel Journey to the West, in which he is recast as the monk Tripitaka, accompanied by the Monkey King, became one of the most beloved stories in Chinese literature. The historical Xuanzang was both more ordinary and more impressive than his fictional counterpart, but religious transmission also had its dark side. The same roots that carried texts and ideas also carried missionaries operating under royal patronage with political agendas. Pilgrims who sometimes served as informal intelligence agents for their home governments, and in some cases, forcible conversion backed by military power. The Islamic expansion into Central Asia in the 7th and 8th centuries CEE brought with it, alongside the genuine appeal of the new religion to many converts, a campaign of destruction of pre-Islamic religious institutions that was not uniformly gentle. Fire temples, Buddhist monasteries, and the material culture of Zoroastrian and Manichaean worship were destroyed in varying degrees across the conquered territories. The pace of Islamicization varied greatly by region and period, and the process was rarely as sudden or as total as a simplified narrative suggests, but the direction of travel toward the replacement of earlier religious traditions by Islam was consistent, and it involved real losses of cultural heritage that cannot be entirely separated from the violence of the conquest that preceded them. The story of Nestorian Christianity on the Silk Road is one of the more poignant religious histories the route has to offer. Expelled from the Roman and Byzantine world by a theological controversy that looks from the outside remarkably esoteric, the question of whether Mary should be called the Mother of God or only the Mother of Christ, the Nestorian Church established itself in the Sasanian Persian Empire, whose rulers were pleased to have a Christian minority that was theologically distinct from and in conflict with the Christianity of their Roman enemies. From Persia, Nestorian missionaries traveled along the Silk Road eastward, establishing communities in Central Asia, then in Tang China, where a Nestorian inscription, in Chinese and Syriac, erected in 781 COE and known as the Nestorian Stele, records the history of the community's presence in China from its arrival in 635 CE. The stele was buried sometime after the Tang dynasty's persecution of foreign religions in the 840s CE, which ordered the expulsion or forced conversion of Nestorian, Zoroastrian, and Manichaean communities in China. It was rediscovered in the 17th century. There is something moving about the Nestorian stele, this record of a Christian community established in the heart of China along the Silk Road, worshiping, translating texts, building churches for 2 centuries before being swept away by a political tide that had nothing to do with faith. The inscription on the stele ends with a poem that asks for the protection of heaven over the church and its community. The church was gone within decades of its composition, but the stele survived. Manichaeism, arguably the most thoroughly road-born of all the Silk Road religions, deserves its own moment. Founded by the prophet Mani in 3rd century Mesopotamia, it was a universal religion in the most literal sense. Mani deliberately synthesized elements of Zoroastrianism, Christianity, and Buddhism into a system he believed could appeal to all peoples, and he designed his religion for travel, training missionaries who could adapt its message to different cultural contexts. Manichaean missionaries traveled the Silk Road in both directions, establishing communities from Egypt to China, and the religion became briefly one of the most geographically widespread faiths in the world. The Uyghur Empire adopted Manichaeism as its state religion in the 8th century CE, which gave the faith a period of official protection in Central Asia that allowed it to survive longer than it might otherwise have done under sustained persecution from the Zoroastrian, Christian, and Buddhist authorities who found its universalist syncretism threatening. By the time the Mongols swept through Central Asia, Manichaeism had been reduced to a handful of small communities. By the 14th century, it was effectively extinct, its texts burned or lost, its believers absorbed into other traditions. It survives today only in fragments, manuscripts recovered from Dunhuang and Turfan, fragments of sacred art, the accounts of hostile heresiologists, and in the word Manichaean, which has entered modern languages as a general term for black and white moral thinking, a meaning that would have horrified its founder, whose actual theology was far more nuanced than the term implies. The Silk Road did not end with a single dramatic event. Like most great historical structures, it faded rather than collapsed, its decline the product of multiple intersecting factors playing out over several centuries. The Black Death was one of them. The pandemic of the mid-14th century killed large proportions of the populations of the cities and regions through which the Silk Road ran, disrupted the political and commercial institutions that sustained the trade, and created a long period of demographic recovery during which the volume of trade necessarily contracted. The Mongol successor states that had sustained the Pax Mongolica fragmented further and became increasingly unstable. The Central Asian cities that had been the great nodes of the road, Samarkand, Merv, Bukhara, lost population and vitality. The demographic collapse produced by the Black Death was not evenly distributed across the Silk Road world, but it was severe almost everywhere the plague reached. In some regions of the Middle East and Central Asia, the mortality in the first outbreak may have been comparable to or greater than the mortality in Europe. Egypt, one of the most densely populated regions along the western end of the route, lost between a third and a half of its population in the first outbreak. Iraq, which sat astride the crucial junction of the overland and maritime routes, was devastated and never fully recovered its pre plague population levels during the medieval period. The great irrigation systems of Mesopotamia, which had sustained some of the most productive agricultural land in the world since the time of Babylon, fell into disrepair as the labor force to maintain them was decimated. The deserts that those irrigation systems had held back began to advance. Timur, known to European history as Tamerlane, reconstituted something like Mongol military power in Central Asia in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, and his devastating campaigns against the Mongol successor states and the Ottoman and Mamluk empires produced a fresh wave of destruction to the cities along the route. Timur had a contradictory relationship with Samarkand. It was his capital, the city he adorned with the spoils of his conquests, the place where he brought captive craftsmen from every city he sacked. The tilework of Samarkand's Registan, still standing, still extraordinary, one of the most beautiful architectural ensembles in the world, was made by craftsmen brought to the city by force from every corner of the Timurid Empire. The beauty and the violence are inseparable, here as everywhere on this road. After Timur's death in 1405, the Timurid Empire fragmented, and Central Asia entered another period of instability. The most decisive factor in the end of the Overland Silk Road was technological. The development of ocean-going sailing ships capable of long-distance navigation in open water. The Portuguese voyages of the late 15th century, Bartolomeu Dias's rounding of the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, Vasco da Gama's voyage to India in 1497 to 1499, opened a maritime route between Europe and Asia that bypassed the entire overland system. The sea route was cheaper, capable of carrying vastly larger volumes of goods, and entirely independent of the political instability of Central Asia and the Middle East. By the 16th century, the bulk of the spice trade between Asia and Europe had shifted to the maritime routes. The overland route continued in diminished form. For centuries longer, there was never a clean break, but it was no longer the primary artery of Eurasian commerce. There is something worth lingering on in the sheer speed of this transition. The maritime route around Africa that made the overland Silk Road obsolete was itself a product of the knowledge and ambition that the Silk Road had generated over its centuries of operation. The geographical knowledge that made Portuguese navigators confident enough to attempt the voyage around Africa was derived partly from Arabic geographical scholarship, which was itself a product of the Islamic Golden Age, which was funded by Silk Road commerce. The Venetian and Genoese merchants, who had been the western end of the Silk Road relay system, were among the most enthusiastic advocates for finding new maritime routes to Asia because they understood better than anyone the value of what was being traded and the costs imposed by the overland route's middlemen. The road, in a sense, contributed to its own obsolescence by generating the wealth and knowledge that motivated the search for an alternative. The Ottoman Empire's conquest of Constantinople in 1453, sometimes cited as a cause of the Silk Road's decline, was probably less significant than the Maritime Revolution. Ottoman control of the eastern Mediterranean made the sea routes to the Levant somewhat more complicated for European merchants, but the Ottomans were generally supportive of trade through their territories, and the sea route around Africa was already becoming more attractive, independent of Ottoman policy. The conventional history that blames the fall of Constantinople for the decline of the Silk Road is probably wrong in its specifics, though the fall did contribute to the European motivation to find alternative maritime routes. What the end of the Silk Road left behind was a landscape of ruins and half ruined cities, of abandoned caravanserais and silted up irrigation systems, of languages and scripts and religious traditions that had survived as long as the trade routes sustained them, and then diminished when the trade moved elsewhere. The Sogdian language, which had been the lingua franca of much of the Silk Road for centuries, died out as a spoken language sometime in the medieval period, surviving only in a few isolated mountain valleys where its descendants are still spoken today. The Uyghur cities of the Tarim Basin, some of them buried under sand and forgotten for centuries, are being slowly excavated, yielding texts in a dozen languages and scripts, paintings of gods and donors in a dozen stylistic traditions, the material residue of a world of extraordinary cultural complexity that existed for centuries and then was covered by the desert. The Silk Road is over, in the sense that the historical network of overland trade routes that bore that name no longer functions as it once did. But what remains of it is extraordinary, and the act of looking at what remains, of sitting with it in the quiet way that this channel is designed for, reveals something about the nature of all human endeavor that is worth dwelling on before we let sleep come. The cave temples of Dunhuang, the Mogao Caves, cut into a cliff face in the desert east of the Taklamakan, contain one of the greatest concentrations of Buddhist art in the world. 492 painted caves, dating from the 4th to the 14th centuries, Sa-i, their walls and ceilings covered in Buddhist paintings of extraordinary quality and variety. They were created by generations of artists working under the patronage of merchants, officials, and pilgrims who traveled the Silk Road past this point and donated the cost of a cave's decoration as a religious act. The paintings show Central Asian faces, Chinese faces, Central Asian and Chinese clothing, and landscape conventions blended in ways that are visually arresting and historically significant. They are the image of the road at its most creative, the point where the cultures it connected were in genuine dialogue, producing something neither could have produced alone. The sealed cave, Cave 17, sometimes called the Library Cave, that was discovered in 1900 contained behind a painted wall a cache of some 40,000 manuscripts and printed texts bundled together and sealed, probably in the early 11th century CE, when the area was under threat from a rival kingdom. The texts are in Chinese, Tibetan, Sanskrit, Sogdian, Khotanese, Uyghur, and half a dozen other languages. They include Buddhist scriptures, Taoist texts, Confucian classics, private letters, business contracts, calendars, medical texts, songs, and poems. They are the library of a world, the accumulated written production of the Silk Road civilization, bundled up and hidden, and then forgotten for 9 centuries. The discovery of the library cave in 1900 by a Taoist monk named Wang Yuanlu, who was living in the Mogao complex and clearing sand from the caves, is one of the more complicated stories in the history of archaeology. Wang sold access to the cave's contents to a series of Western and Japanese explorers and scholars who visited Dunhuang in the early 20th century. The British archaeologist Aurel Stein, the French sinologist Paul Pelliot, the Japanese explorer Count Kozui Otani, and others. They removed tens of thousands of manuscripts and many of the most significant objects, which are now distributed across museums and libraries in London, Paris, St. Petersburg, Beijing, and Tokyo. The Chinese response to this dispersal, at the time, largely passive, because the Qing dynasty was in no position to assert control over its distant western territories. Later, as China developed a stronger sense of cultural heritage, increasingly anguished, raises questions about ownership, colonialism, and the ethics of acquisition that remain deeply contested today. The manuscripts themselves, wherever they are now held, have been digitized and made publicly available through the International Dunhuang Project, a collaborative effort of the institutions that hold them. This means that you can, at this moment, access a scanned image of that Sogdian merchant's undelivered letter, or a printed Buddhist text dating to 868 CEE that is the world's oldest dated printed book, or a calendar from the Tang dynasty with someone's marginal notes in the margins. The road that carried these things is gone. The people who wrote them have been gone for 1,000 years. But what they left is still there, patient as the desert, waiting to be read. They are there because someone, at the moment of threat, thought they were worth saving. That act of preservation, that judgment that these texts, in all their languages, from all their traditions, mattered, is one of the quietly heroic acts of the Silk Road story. We do not know who made the decision. We do not know if they survived whatever threat prompted it. We know only that the texts were sealed in the dark, and that they waited, and that they are now one of the primary sources for our knowledge of a civilization that the desert had otherwise largely consumed. The caravanserais, the roadside inns that punctuated the route at intervals designed for the capacity of a loaded camel, survive in varying states of preservation across the route. The great ribats of Central Asia, the Khans of Anatolia and the Levant, the sarais of Persia, massive stone buildings, some of them capable of sheltering hundreds of people and thousands of animals, built with the seriousness of permanent architecture in the middle of deserts and mountains where permanence was always under threat. Some of them are inhabited or partially inhabited today. Many are ruins. A few have been restored as heritage sites, their great stone halls now echoingly empty of the camel smell and the Arabic and Persian and Sogdian conversation and the sounds of animals settling in the dark. The silk itself, when it has survived, is beautiful in a way that is difficult to describe without sounding merely descriptive. The textiles recovered from Silk Road sites, from the caves of Dunhuang, from burial sites in Central Asia, from church treasuries in Europe, where early medieval silks were preserved wrapped around the relics of saints, are some of the most technically accomplished and aesthetically extraordinary objects in the history of human craft. The colors are still vivid in many cases, protected from light by the darkness of the contexts in which they were preserved. The patterns, confronted animals, hunting scenes, the great rundel designs that traveled from Sasanian Persia across the entire length of the route, are endlessly varied and endlessly accomplished. They were made by skilled hands under difficult conditions, carried across thousands of kilometers of dangerous terrain, and they are still here. The road is not gone. It has changed its form, as everything does. The container ships that carry goods from China to Europe in 3 weeks travel a route whose logic connect the world's great production centers to its great consumption centers by the most efficient available path is the same logic that drove the Silk Road caravans. The fiber optic cables that carry data under the oceans follow routes that in some cases shadow the old maritime silk roads. The cities that were great then are in some cases great again. Xi'an, Istanbul, Tbilisi, Samarkand. The cultures that met and mixed along the routes have left their marks on each other in ways that are still visible in food, in music, in language, in architectural form. The darkness is still there too, in its new forms. The drug trade that moves along some of the same corridors as the ancient trade in silk and spices. The trafficking in people that continues the most terrible of the Silk Road's commercial streams. The diseases that move along modern networks with the same terrible efficiency that plague moved along the old ones. The road was always both of these things, the silk and the plague, the art and the destruction, the connection and the violence. And it is not surprising that its successors carry both as well. But for now, that is enough darkness. You have traveled far enough for one night. The Silk Road stretched for more than 12,000 kilometers across some of the most challenging terrain on Earth. It lasted, in one form or another, for more than 1,000 years. It was traversed by merchants and monks and soldiers and diplomats and pilgrims and refugees and enslaved people and plague rats and artists carrying patterns in their heads that would take root in new soil and bloom into something the original gardeners would not have recognized. Consider what it means to hold the whole arc of it in your mind at once. At its eastern end, the great imperial workshops of Chang'an, where women and children bent over silk frames in compulsory labor for the tax quota, producing textiles of extraordinary beauty. At its western end, a Roman senator in a toga of Chinese silk, probably unaware that China was a real country and not a mythical land of silk spinners at the edge of the world, the origin of the fabric he wore as far from his understanding as the moon. Between them, 12,000 kilometers of desert and mountain and steppe, populated by nomads and oasis farmers and merchants and monks and bandits, all moving through a web of political instability and natural danger, sustained by the mutual need of the civilizations at each end for what the other had. The road ran through all of this, continuous and interrupted, safe and dangerous, productive and destructive, for 1,000 years. And then the ships got good enough to go around Africa instead, and the road became a memory, and then it became a ruin, and then it became a subject for historians and archaeologists, and eventually for sleep stories told late at night to people who are lying in the dark and finding it easier somehow to think about the past than to stop thinking altogether. It is gone now, and it is also still there. The caves at Dunhuang are still being studied. The manuscripts in their dozens of languages are still being translated. The caravanserais are still standing in the desert. The silk is still in the church treasuries, and the stories of the people who walked those roads. The Sogdian merchant stranded in Dunhuang for 3 years, writing letters that were never delivered. the pilgrim Xuanzang hanging from the side of a Palmer cliff on a road made of wooden planks driven into the rock face, the residents of Merv who walked out of their city thinking they were surrendering to mercy and did not walk back, the unnamed woman who sewed her silkworm eggs into her headdress and carried them across the border of an empire, changing the world's economy forever. Those stories are still here too. I hope you found your way there and back safely tonight. I hope the road was slow enough and dark enough and long enough to carry you all the way to sleep. If you're still listening, or if you're just now waking up and checking your phone, thank you genuinely. Leave me a comment telling me where in the world you are and what time it is there. And tell me what you'd like to hear about next, what history you want to fall asleep inside. I read every comment and I keep a list, and more often than you might think. Those comments are how the next video gets made. If this channel has become part of how you end your days, the kindest thing you can do is subscribe. It takes one tap and it makes a real difference. And when you come back, which I hope you will, there are more roads to travel. The Black Death, ancient Egypt, the Viking world, the great empires, the forgotten cities, the quiet, ordinary lives of people long gone. They are all waiting, patient as the desert, patient as a sealed cave with 40,000 manuscripts inside, patient as a caravanserai whose doors have been closed for 600 years. They will be there when you return. Sleep well. The road is long, but you don't have to travel it tonight. Good night.